Hello, I'm Amanda Thomson. I work at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology in Midlothian. For the past 15 years, I've worked on calculating and reporting greenhouse gas emissions and removals from land use and forestry, both back into the past and forward into the future. I'll start by talking about Scotland's current land use, and then in a bit more detail about carbon sinks and sources in forests, peatland and farmland, and then I'll finish with a brief look at what the future might hold for Scotland's land. Scotland is covered by a mix of farmland, forests, urban development and wilder areas on the coasts and mountains, but all of it is used and affected by humans in some way. Since the 1940s, semi-natural habitats such as native woodland, heather moorland and blanket bog have declined, mostly replaced by non-native woodland plantations and rough grazing land. Urban development has increased, mostly on lowland agricultural land. Arable land used for crops has expanded since the 1940s, but this area has contracted slightly in the last 20 years, and Scotland has lost half its hedgerows since the end of the Second World War. Since 1990, Scotland's forest area has increased by 3,500 square kilometres and urban development by 440 square kilometres, replacing grass and arable land. Today, about 19% of Scotland is covered by woodland, 24% by agricultural land, 2% by urban land, and 55% by upland grassland and other semi-natural habitats. Land use and forestry is one of the sectors in the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. The annual amounts reported in the inventory are used to track Scotland's progress against its climate change targets. The emissions from land use and forestry are mostly of carbon dioxide, but there are also small emissions of methane and nitrous oxide. The land use and forestry sector is the only part of the national inventory that can have a net sink, that is, a net removal of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. This net sink is actually made up of larger sources and sinks of carbon dioxide from soils and vegetation. So this means we can increase the net carbon sink by increasing our existing sinks or by reducing our existing sources. Now I'm going to talk about forest and woodland cover, which is the biggest carbon sink in Scotland at the moment. Forests cover 19% of Scotland, which is the highest amount in the UK, but still much lower than the European average of 42%. Much of this woodland is non-native conifer plantation that has been planted in the last 60 years, and the forest carbon sink has been growing with the trees. However, as these trees reach maturity, their growth rate slows down and they are usually harvested at that point. So Scotland's forest carbon sink will stabilise or even shrink slightly over the next few years. Most of the harvested areas will be replanted, but it takes time for trees to grow, so it will take another 50 years before the harvested areas store the same amount of carbon. The way to have an ever-increasing forest carbon sink is to plant an increasing area of land with trees, or to plant trees that grow and store carbon more rapidly. Tree species that are native to this country might have slower rates of growth, but they have many other benefits, and if left to grow, will store more carbon over 100 years than non-native conifers that are regularly felled and replanted. Native tree species are better for biodiversity and for soil and water quality. When planting trees for the future, we also have to consider which is the right tree in the right place, so that we plant woodlands that are resilient and can survive the effects of climate change, pests and diseases. An additional way that trees can help to store carbon is in timber products. At the moment, most UK produced timber goes to products with short lifetimes like paper and cardboard, so the carbon stored within the products returns to the atmosphere in a few years. If we can shift towards using timber for things with a longer lifetime, like buildings, then the carbon will be stored for decades or longer. Currently, 85% of new homes in Scotland are built using wood, nearly 3 times the amount in England and Wales, but only 1/3 of these new houses are built using Scottish-grown timber. The Scottish Government has a forestry strategy to increase Scotland's woodlands area to 21% by 2032 and increase tree planting rates to 15,000 hectares a year from 2025. This is a rapid shift from the average annual rate of 6,000 hectares a year over the past decade. About 42% of all this new planting is native woodland. An immense amount of carbon is stored in Scotland's soils, more than 3,000 megatons, and about 60 times more than is stored in trees and other plants. Over 50% of this carbon is stored in peat soils. Natural peatlands are a special habitat with high water tables, so moss and other plants don't fully decay when they die, and carbon accumulates over time. Much of Scotland's drinking water filters through peat soils. Peatlands are rare globally. The Flow country in Caithness and Sutherland is thought to be the largest area of blanket bog in the world and is being considered as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The carbon in peat soils is built up over thousands of years, but it can be lost far more rapidly. When peat soils are drained, they can be valuable for agriculture, but they also have high rates of greenhouse gas emissions. Peatlands are a very active topic of scientific research, and at the moment emissions from peat soils are not fully included in the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. However, they will be fully reported in the next 2 years. Scotland already has targets for peatland restoration. 25,000 hectares have already been restored, with a target of 250,000 hectares by 2030. It can take decades for restored peatlands to fully recover to the point when they can act as a carbon sink again. However, restoring peatlands avoids further carbon losses, and they are able to store water better, which may help with flood regulation, and these peatlands will be better able to cope with climate change in the future. What about the potential for Scotland's farmland to store more carbon? Scotland's soils already contain a lot of carbon, so there is less potential for additional carbon storage in soils than there is elsewhere in the world. It's important to protect the carbon already stored in soils, because as we've seen with peatlands, carbon stores in soils take a long time to accumulate but can be lost very rapidly. Sustainable management by farmers can protect the soil already there, and there is a lot of research into how it might be possible to increase soil carbon stocks, particularly in grassland, by techniques like mob grazing or by adding biochar, a special kind of charcoal, to the soil. Increasing the number of trees on farms, planting new hedgerows and growing new perennial energy crops can also increase carbon storage. More trees on farmland can provide shade and shelter for livestock and crops, increase biodiversity and can help with air pollution. For example, tree shelter belts around poultry sheds can capture ammonia, which improves air quality downwind. Scotland's land use is also tied into where people live. Over the next 20 years, Scotland's population is projected to increase by over 100,000 people, with population increasing more in the urban council areas and decreasing in more rural areas. This additional population will need housing and infrastructure and will compete with agriculture for land. Including more green space and trees in urban areas can both store carbon and make them more pleasant places to live in. So what does the future hold for land use in Scotland? There is a great emphasis on tree planting and woodland expansion, but trees take time to grow, so we need to consider the landscape not just over the next 25 years, but over the next 100 years. The tree planted today that will store the most carbon by 2045 might not be the tree that you want in the long term. We need to protect our existing carbon stores, particularly peatlands. I haven't touched on blue carbon either, that is, carbon stored in coastal and marine habitats. Currently, we don't know much about how carbon storage works in these habitats, or how permanent these carbon stores may be. With the removal of the EU's Common Agricultural Policy post-Brexit, there is a movement in all parts of the UK towards farm payments for public goods and environmental practices that improved soil and air quality and reduced greenhouse gas emissions. There is the potential for moving some types of food production off the land entirely and into indoor farming. Alternatively, intensifying agricultural production on some farmland could free up land for other uses, such as rewilding. The Scottish Government's land use strategy sets out the policies and actions for achieving sustainable land use in Scotland. Scotland's land assets and the opportunities for carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere are one of the main reasons that the Committee on Climate Change thinks that Scotland can achieve its 2045 net zero target.